Oops! Seems like this presidential administration has lost a whole human being. How does that happen? Let's break that down. Hi, I'm Melba Pearson, also known as the Resident Legal Diva, and this is The Breakdown. So, in a startling admission, the current presidential administration admits they accidentally deported a Maryland resident to El Salvador. And now they say, oops, there's nothing we can do about it. So here's how all of this went down. As we know, the current presidential administration has been deporting people under the Alien Enemies Act. This is a 1798 law that they basically blew the dust off of and brought it back to be able to deport people at will without a hearing, without any due process, anything along those lines. There's been an outcry about, wait a minute, these people are not going through trial. How do you know that these people are truly a danger to the United States, a danger to the community? Because many of the people who have been deported to Venezuela, as well as to a very notorious prison in El Salvador, some of these folks were undocumented, but others were people who were in the citizenship process. They were either here under temporary protected status, or they were here seeking asylum, something along those lines. Now, in the most high-profile problematic case to date, we now have a situation with a gentleman by the name of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. He's a Salvadorian national, and he was placed on one of 3 deportation flights back to his home country. This apparently happened back on March 15th. And this kicked off a huge battle because his attorney was like, wait a minute, he's not supposed to go. And a federal judge had also barred further removals under the Alien Enemies Act while the proceedings were playing out in court. The presidential administration went to the Supreme Court. There's been an expedited docket on that. We're still waiting to see what the plaintiffs, the attorneys for the immigrants, what their response will be. And that's all pending. But in the meantime, there weren't supposed to be any more flights. There's that. We're going to put that to the side for now. So, going back to Mr. Abrego Garcia, he was deemed by an immigration judge back in 2019 to be a likely member of the MS-13 gang. However, Mr. Abrego Garcia firmly denies this, and this information was credited to a confidential informant, which is problematic as it is, because generally, let's think of it this way. If it was a criminal case and you had evidence that came from a confidential informant, that can't be the only thing for you to be convicted and found guilty. There's got to be some other evidence, right? So playing that out in the immigration, from an immigration perspective, you have a situation where you have the word of one confidential informant that says, hey, this person is in a gang, but no other surrounding evidence. He has no criminal history that we're aware of in the United States. He has not been linked to any gang activity that we know of in the United States. He resides in Maryland with his spouse and child, and he seemed to have no problems as of the last few years. So at the time of this hearing back in 2019, while the judge did say it was a possibility he could be in a gang, the court also agreed at the time that he should not be deported back to El Salvador because they found that his feeling and his fear of being persecuted was credible. So he was here, again, seeking asylum, and the court said, hey, he does have a credible claim that something bad, really bad will happen to him if he goes back to El Salvador. So as a result of this court's ruling, he was released from custody and he's been living with his wife, who's a U.S. citizen, and his child. So fast forward from 2019 to March 12th of this year. He was arrested by ICE and then sent to El Salvador on March 15th. It's only because his wife recognized him on a video with his hair shaven, and he was in shackles in a line of prisoners, and this was all being overseen by Salvadorian authorities. So she's like, oh my gosh, this is the worst case scenario. Mr. Abrego Garcia's counsel is now petitioning a federal judge to force the U.S. Department of Justice to bring him back to U.S. custody. Well, the presidential administration says, well, there's nothing we can do here. We can't make him come back. Oopsie, it's an administrative error, but we still believe he's a gang member. Okay, well, a judge already ruled on that already. So why are you now trying to deport this man who has a credible fear for his life and now drop him in a place where he's likely to go missing or be killed? So now this is going to be left to a U.S. district judge to make the decision as to whether or not the Department of Justice has to go find a way to bring him back, or if they're going to capitulate to what the presidential administration is asking for, which is basically reject a petition and just call it an oopsie and just leave it at that. So basically, the argument that the presidential administration is using right now is that the government messed up, of course, in removing him and specifically sending him to El Salvador. So I think their mindset is, well, it would have been okay if we sent him to Venezuela, not El Salvador, but be that as it may. And they said that they wouldn't have deported him to El Salvador if they believed that doing so would violate the U.S.'s obligations under an international anti-torture treaty. Well, guess what? Your actions just did. And so now, as this error, we're going to just put it in quotes, error is starting to generate a ton of press coverage. Now, the vice president jumped in and was basically mocking the gentleman at the center of this, basically saying that he's a convicted MS-13 gang member. And again, with the misinformation, because again, he's never been convicted of being a gang member. This is literally a snitch who was like, hey, I think so-and-so is a gang member, probably doing it just to help themselves out of whatever situation they're in. Because again, going back to testimony from confidential informants, they usually have a motive, whether it's payment, whether it's trying to work off criminal charges that they already have, or some other reason to give false information. It happens. We've known confidential informants to do that. So if you're hanging your entire case and your entire argument on the word of a snitch, I don't think you're in the best position. So going back to the misinformation, he has never been a convicted gang member. There's no conviction, whether here and as far as we know overseas, that links him to being in a gang. So what next? The judge is going to have to make a decision as to whether or not the Department of Justice has to now go find Mr. Abrego Garcia and bring him back. Or the judge's other option is to say, okay, this was an administrative error, too bad, so sad, which leaves the Abrego Garcia family with pretty much no recourse, which is pretty disturbing. So we'll see what the judge's ruling is with regards to this issue, and then moving forward, figuring out how to find him and how to bring him back. Now, again, a treaty goes two ways, right? So this presidential administration has made a treaty with El Salvador to take these folks and to keep them in custody. And so therefore, they should be able to go back to the president of El Salvador and say, hey, we messed up. We need these people back. Go find them. And if they're not able to find them, again, that is really shining a light on how problematic this use of the Alien Enemies Act is, because again, people are being deported. There's no hearing. There's nothing to interrogate the evidence to establish whether or not the person really should go. Because again, he was here as a refugee fleeing persecution in El Salvador. So what are we doing here? We will have to see what the path forward is. I'm Melba Pearson, also known as the Resident Legal Diva, and this is The Breakdown. Take care.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.